Hi, everybody. Welcome to City Talk. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. We're very pleased to have you join us once again. Midday here in central Canada, a little earlier in the morning on the West Coast, and mid-morning for those coming in from Alberta, and from the East, you've got to jump on us. You're already making your afternoon tea. We are very appreciative of the audiences that we're getting for these. These are really important conversations for us to help make sense of what's going on during COVID and how we're imagining what the future will be like for us together collectively. The Canadian Urban Institute's in the connective tissue business. We're all about how do we actually build the capacity for us to learn from one another, from urban environment to community. And as you know, since COVID, we've put up a number of platforms. One, citywatchcanada.ca, which is showing what municipal governments are doing. City Talk Canada, which is the one you're on now, which is how we're trying to actually make sense of what's going on. And then City Share Canada, which is where communities and community organizations, institutions and individuals and all sorts of a groundswell of response that we're continuing to see in communities as we try to improvise and DIY our way out of what the solutions need to be. This is being powered by volunteers and partners across the country. And so if you've got bandwidth, if you've got a bit of time to put into helping us watch a city, share what's going on in your city, or help us try to understand how we can interpret what our next sets of steps should be, please email us at covidresponse@canurb.org. covidresponse@canurb.org. Have we got a task for you? And if you've got half an hour a day, we'll take it. Very, very appreciative of all the volunteers that we already have working on this. And we need to put all hands on deck, mobilize everyone we can get. So if you've got bandwidth, please help us. This is the, I think, fourth week that we've been doing these city talks, and they've been extraordinarily popular. Everything gets posted afterwards. We videotape these, and we share them with people, and we hope you'll share them with people. And they have a long tail. I think that's the current vernacular that we're to say. So lots to learn here as we track this all together. These broadcasts originate in Toronto, but we have participants from across the country. But just to acknowledge that Toronto is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, and the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It's now home to many diverse First Nations, from Inuit and Métis peoples, from across Turtle Island. And Toronto was also covered by Treaty 13, which was signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Anishinaabe nations. And we are cognizant of that, and we are cognizant of the rich history that Canada has and the challenges that that poses us in terms of coming to terms with truth and reconciliation. And boy, oh boy, do we ever see how COVID exposes the unevenness of how people experience urban environments. And that's why this session today is so important, homelessness and housing, and how we're going to navigate it during this crisis and as we emerge into whatever the heck our new normal is, and will it be a better normal? We put these conversations up very cognizant that there are thousands and thousands of Canadians still engaged on the front lines doing emergency services, and these conversations are not a substitute for that, and we are not trying in any way to distract from the efforts to save lives and to try to keep people safe. So they are going in parallel, and we are wanting to acknowledge all the efforts that first line workers are continuing to be consumed by. The conversation also doesn't end here. It is a live conversation, and we encourage you that are using social media to use hashtag CityTalk on Twitter and keep this conversation going, because these are Gordian knots, right? These are not simple issues, not simple problems, no simple solution. And we just want this to start us off, and that's why we're so appreciative of this gang gathering with us today to try to help us navigate that conversation. There is a chat function here on the right-hand side, at least it's on the right-hand side of my screen. And we would encourage all folks that are signed on this session to get into that chat box and throw in some ideas and ask some questions. And when you do so, please direct them. You'll see there's a little toggle switch at the bottom where you can direct it to all panelists and attendees. What we're finding on these is that a whole rich life starts to live over there in that chat box, and you can often answer each other's questions much more effectively than we can over here on the broadcast. So please direct all your comments to panelists and attendees. And just remember, it's not Vegas, folks. Those of you that have been on several of these talks are going to get tired of my little preamble. Just remember, what goes up on the chat stays up on the chat. So keep that in mind when you post things, because it'll then go online and then everybody will see exactly what it was that you thought was a brilliant idea at the time. Not that that's to caution you, but just be aware. We're recording these sessions, as you can see. And as I suggested, it's just the beginning of what we hope is a really rich dialogue, because we're not going to solve any of these topics in a one-hour session ever, just the beginning. So joining us from coast to coast, we've got Margaret Pfoh from the Aboriginal Housing Management Association in Vancouver, John van Nostrand, who wears a number of hats but is here in Parcel Development from Ontario, Tim Richter in Calgary, who runs the Alliance to End Homelessness, and Leilani Farha, who we're repatriating from her extended gig with the UN, where she took one for the team, and now she's, I hope, I think 3 days into being back into normal life in Ottawa. So we're very happy to have you four and to help us navigate this, because I think it's a profoundly challenging conversation. Topic. I had written a couple of weeks ago that COVID was like a particle accelerator, that everything that was dysfunctional in urban environments before COVID was just laid bare, and now you really see it, and it's a lot worse than we thought. And I think that this topic, and why it's so popular and so many people have signed up for it, is that it's very, very clear that there's a lot of trouble here in the housing sector and in the homelessness response discourse. And we appreciate that we've merged these topics into one session, but it's a whole bunch of topics, and we know that we don't want to oversimplify it. And so I'm going to leave it in your hands to figure out how we want to prioritize what we talk about. But let's just start, if we could, with Margaret, who's there with a bucolic image behind her of a lovely golf course. And perhaps the golf courses have opened in Vancouver. I don't know. They may be on the verge of, I know they're talking about in other parts of the country, but I don't think you're on a golf course. I think that's a Zoom background. But Margaret, we're very happy to have you join us. And I'm going to ask each of you to just give me 90 seconds on what are you seeing? What have you been observing over the last 7 weeks? Over to you, Margaret. Thanks for joining us.
Toyak Sitnin, thank you, Mary, for that introduction. Toyak Sim, thank you everyone for being here today. I am Margaret Pfoh. I'm Sim Shan. I am a member of the Lakwa Lambs band in Prince Rupert, but I am a descendant of the Eagle clan of the Gitga'at First Nation in Hartley Bay. And I'm a 60s scoop child. So my perspective on a lot of these issues comes from that background. What we're seeing over here in British Columbia is amazing resilience, amazing cooperation. We're seeing a lot of rapid response, both from our organization and from the province of BC. But what we are seeing is exactly what you had highlighted in your preamble, and that is the disparities that existed prior to COVID-19 have only been exacerbated because of COVID-19, especially from an urban Indigenous perspective. What we're seeing is all of those things that urban Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and the dispossessed Indigenous people are actually exacerbated. So we tend to often rank the highest on the worst scales. Highest in incarceration, highest in homelessness, highest in addiction, highest in children in care, highest in domestic violence, highest likelihood that we as Indigenous women are likely to die from a violent death. And so what we're seeing here in British Columbia, despite all of the amazing and wonderful efforts of our government and the partnerships across our housing sector, to be as responsive as we possibly can be, we are seeing that our most vulnerable populations are at even greater risk right now, especially with the increase in domestic violence. The order to stay home has had long-lasting impacts to our housing sector with regards to domestic violence, both for our women and for our children, but also for our elders and our seniors as well. And so taking a look at what that has highlighted for us means that we have to start thinking about what are our solutions after COVID-19 has started to decline and after we're able to open everything up. And I'm sure we're going to get to that, so I don't want to go into all of that conversation at this particular moment, but most certainly we're looking at needing to have a more overt decision-making processes that will actually try to close the gap between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples.
Before I leave you, can you just tell people a little bit about the organization you run?
Yeah, so our organization is the first in Canada, second in the world, to be a for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing entity. We run the Aboriginal Housing Management Association here in British Columbia. We have a arm's length board of directors, arm's length meaning our entire board of directors are not receiving any of the public funds that we flow through in terms of subsidy to our housing providers. And we have 41 housing providers under our umbrella right now. We have more coming under the last provincial call for housing. They put out 1,700 units for Indigenous people. And in year one, they had 1,100 already allocated. So I think we were a little underestimating the needs because that was a 10-year strategy for 1,700.
Wow, and it was taken up in 1 year.
In 1 year.
Yeah, well, that in a nutshell talks about the scale of the dilemma. Eh?
Absolutely.
Okay, let's go a little further east to the sunny province, although I hear you're getting snow, but so are we in Ontario, just so you know, in Alberta. Tim, are you in Calgary? Is that where you are today?
I am in Calgary, yes.
Tell us about what you've been seeing in your purview for the last 7 weeks. What are you seeing?
For sure. Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that here in Calgary, we're on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Nation, which includes the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai. Also want to acknowledge that the Tsuut'ina, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, the Métis Nation, Region 3, and everybody that makes up Treaty 7 here in Southern Alberta. So I lead the Canadian Alliance to End Homelessness, and we've been working with cities and towns across the country. And you referred to COVID-19 as a particle accelerator. I refer to it as a guided missile, and it is I've heard this from a couple of my medical colleagues who refer to it as a guided missile that's aimed at vulnerable people. And you see that play out across the country. If you look at the profile of those at greatest risk, people that are older, people that have pre-existing medical conditions, people that aren't able to self-isolate or access healthcare, that describes the homeless population in our country in large measure. And what I've observed is a homeless system becoming a public health system with little or no support from public health systems to respond quickly to an emergency that is already making the life expectancy of their clients 25 years less, right? Wow. And so that if there hasn't been a catastrophic loss of life among people experiencing homelessness, that is only because of the existing public health measures, keeping people at home, but B, the heroic effort of people that are working in frontline agencies that have been scrambling for the last month or so in the absence of public health support, in the absence of meaningful support from many municipal emergency management agencies that have been dealing with lack of PPE and really struggling on staffing and a lack of donations. So it's almost like crises layered upon crises for frontline organizations. You have the homeless crisis, you have the opioid crisis, and now you have a pandemic. And yet we are not yet seeing that kind of huge outbreaks. We see outbreaks in places, certainly important and certainly dangerous and very worrying, but not to the scale that you might have expected. I had often likened it to what could have happened. What could happen is a lot like what has happened in long-term care. But the fact that it hasn't, I think, is a testament to frontline agencies and cities.
And some nimble responses. We had the mayor of Victoria, Lisa Helps, on last week for a city talk, and she was describing how they had to really quickly move their safe consumption sites and their homelessness outreach services into parks. And of course, they were benefited that the weather was okay. They could do that. It's kind of hard to do that where there's still 3 inches of snow on the ground. But it's interesting, Tim. It also may be early days yet, right? Yes. We may not really know yet. Okay, thanks. Let's keep going. Let's keep going east. John, we'll go to you now. John van Nostrand and the cow. I know there's a story about why you're in front of a cow, but cows in the city, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, over to you, John. Tell us about you're a practitioner. You've been in this field for a long time, and you've worked overseas, I know, on this. And in fact, you came to see me in New Orleans when I was in New Orleans after Katrina. So you are very familiar with these kinds of all-encompassing disaster zones. So talk to us about what you've been seeing. You're muted, John. You're muted.
I'm an architect planner, training, and I have an
Okay, John. We're going to stop you again because your mic is breaking up. So let's do this. If you could, we had a little problem during the check, so we know there's a little glitch. Dial out, come on back on, and when you come on back on, I'll pick you up, okay? So we can hopefully fix the sound. So don't panic, everybody. John's going to leave temporarily, and then he'll come back. Leilani, let's go to you. You're in Ottawa now, but you've just had this extraordinary 5-year run. 5 years, I think, right?
Six years. 6 years.
Oh,
yes.
Time for it. So obviously your purview is going to be quite broad. So talk to us about what you've been seeing in the last 7 weeks. What have you been seeing?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, I think it's super important to recognize that housing is actually the frontline defense against COVID-19. And that's not just in Canada, that's global, and it comes out of the World Health Organization. And that's because governments around the world and the World Health Organization know that you have to stay home and wash your hands and physical distance to flatten the curve and resist this virus. But that puts housing front and center. What's been so surprising to me is that's caught governments by surprise. So all governments everywhere are like, yeah, stay home, wash your hands, physical distance. And then they're like, oh, shoot, we have a homeless population for whom staying home isn't possible.
There ain't no home to home too.
That's right. And oh dear, we have people living in housing precarity who can't pay their rent and could be homeless. And then suddenly this scurrying around of activity to try to protect those populations. And all of this to me is suggestive of the fact that governments have been very poor in terms of effectively implementing their human rights obligations with respect to housing pre-pandemic. So this has laid bare, as others have said, this has laid bare the homelessness crisis. It has laid bare discrimination against people living in homelessness, and it has laid bare the housing crisis that so many people are experiencing in terms of unaffordability. Think about the fact that after 1 month of unemployment or underemployment, thousands and thousands of people in this country couldn't pay their rent. After 1 month, what does that suggest? It suggests that people's incomes are not commensurate with the cost of rent. One of the things that has also sort of surprised me is, while I think there are some good examples appearing in Canada, I actually don't find some of the most innovative and creative stuff happening here to address the populations that we're talking about who are really suffering, people living in homelessness and housing precarity. I really like looking at the countries who have experienced real rock bottoming out during the global financial crisis in 2008. If you look at what Italy, Spain, and Greece are doing, they have come up with some interesting things to really protect tenants and people living in homelessness, because they know what happens if you don't do that. They know about suicide rates. They know about the depth of poverty that is going to result from this pandemic. And so, you know, things like ensuring protection of genuine no eviction across the country protection, no eviction, including for 6 months after the emergency ends. That's, for example, Spain. I can give lots more examples, but I think my 90 seconds are up.
Yeah, hang on and we'll come back to that and start talking about solutions. John, let's hear from you. And I have a gut instinct here that the best thing for you is to speak, and then don't mute your mic, because I think what happens is your system doesn't like it when you come off a mute. But let's hear from you now. Fingers crossed that you sound good.
Right, so I'm just going to talk a bit about the practical side. I am an architect and planner, been very involved in this field for 35, 40 years. 3 years ago, I became a developer because I could see that governments can't possibly solve this. And it needs other kinds of interventions, and particularly from developers. To me, are people who own property. That's everybody's a developer, owns a piece of property potentially, and that's the way we look at it. So right now, what we're been involved in is developing 2 condominiums in Hamilton, which are geared to incomes between $30,000 and $120,000 dollars a year. You need 120 to buy a condominium right now. So that gets people on a basic wage or a living wage. And on the below that level, we have tied into the reinterest here, and now it's actually peaking here in the whole idea of transitional housing. So we first encountered that in Europe when we visited there post the high levels of migration there. I think Margaret would know that in Vancouver, they began to embrace the transitional housing, the BC government. So this is housing that's built quickly and rapidly, can be put up within 6 to 8 weeks, and can become permanent over time. It can start off by housing people in shelter, and converting that to transitional and on to permanent. And we're very much involved in that right now. There's been our first project announced in Toronto, which is significant. It's in the Star today, reported. And we're working on building a prototype in Hamilton right now. And we'll be bidding on that kind of housing and working with, I think, the social providers who've been our former clients. So the YWCA, Evangel Hall, HouseLink, Community Homes, a whole variety of so-called social providers. But we've always been dealing with homelessness from the beginning, but then now into I would call it continuum of care. So we have a continuum of dying. We've worked that out. We haven't figured out how to establish a continuum for housing for people to enter into housing. We're really good at the last side. We do nothing at the beginning. We're really poor at it. And I agree with Leilani that Canada's way behind in this area. And we're missing, on top of that, a huge economy. Housing's the biggest economy we have. And it's now wrapped up in 25 sort of developers in our region. It's ridiculous. 40% of all new renovations and additions are done without a building permit. And nobody will acknowledge that. So we have informal housing. We have the equivalent of what we've seen in large cities in Africa and Asia, where you've got people just get on with it and squat and buy some property, whether legally or not, and start building. And we need to engage in that. And we actually supported that up until 1950. You know, a lot of people don't realize that in all the major Canadian cities across, in 1950, somewhere between 35 and 43% of households were involved in creating their own housing. And they did that. I'm not talking about DIY necessarily. I'm talking about managing that process. And I think we've lost that altogether, which is why we're in a jam, because planning, and I'm speaking as a planner, they wanted everything to be fixed and finished. And when you do, it costs a lot of money. So it looks good, but it only accommodates 35% of the population.
Yeah, we got preoccupied with tidy, didn't we? Well, it wouldn't be a city talk without somebody calling out planners for something not having done right. We've got lots of planners on this call, and I hope they'll start chatting up. And also, anyone that has lived experience with homelessness or housing precarity, we encourage you to express yourself on the chat function here, because we're aware that this is a challenge that many Canadians experience, and many of us don't even realize that people have experienced it in our own circles. So, folks, here's the dilemma we've got. You know, there are policy questions, there are financing and money questions, and then there are sort of practical supply questions. So where do you want to start? Do you want to start at the 30,000 foot level where Leilani was pressing to suggest that we need some kind of overarching public policy that reinforces people's entitlement to a home? Is that the intervention point that we should be aiming at? Leilani, I think you would say so. Tim, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll jump in and Leilani can correct me. But I think, so a couple of things. We got to think about, why do we have homelessness in Canada? Modern mass homelessness, like we see it today, has not always existed, right? It began in the mid 80s, exploded in the 90s, and we, people say homelessness is a choice, but they're usually individualizing homelessness. Homelessness was a policy choice, or a couple of policy choices that are compounded by broken systems. So in the 90s, the federal government decided to stop investing in housing altogether, right? They also cut transfers to provinces. So we talk often about the housing side of the equation. We've got to remember the income side of this equation. That created modern mass homelessness. If you look in Calgary, Calgary's got one of the longest running point in time counts. In 1992, they counted around 400 people. By 2008, that number was 4,000, right? That is modern mass homelessness in Canada is a direct result of federal policy decisions. Now, they live in the cities, right? This problem lands in the lap of the cities, right? And it was created by senior jurisdictions, but cities have to respond. One of the things that I've observed, if you look anywhere you look in the country, anywhere you look in the world, where there has been success in reducing homelessness, you see strong local leadership. Because more often than not, the city, homelessness becomes a product of these policy decisions and broken systems and lands in the lap of the cities, but then it turns into the political equivalent of a high school dance, where you've got the different layers and levels of government all looking at one another, pointing the finger at each other, saying, you go first. And in Canada, and in the United States in particular, where I've seen the greatest progress is where city leadership takes the bull by the horns and brings those levels of government together. And at a local level, there is, you have to build these data-driven, coordinated local systems to help undo the problem. And the data-driven piece is important because we have to have that person-specific data. And that, to me, is the key to accessing the right to housing, because if you are invisible to the system, you can't access your rights. But that data-driven system is key.
Can I just pursue you on one of these things? I mean, you're suggesting that, do we lay it all at the federal government's feet, that they somehow withdrew their funding and their incentive programs to continue to build housing? What about John's piece that basically there obviously were other kinds of forces at work here, that people themselves were disempowered? What do you think about that piece of it?
I think it's both and, right? So I think you got the federal government backed out, downloaded the problem on the provinces. The provinces had no financial capacity to deal with it, downloaded that further, right? Compounding that, you have provincial systems, child intervention, other systems that are dumping people into homelessness, right? The federal government has an accountability and a leadership role in housing, and I think, Leilani and our partners have been fairly successful in getting them back on that hook. But this is as you say, is a Gordian knot, and I think there's a little bit of everything involved. But one of the things we tend to do in planning and in responding to homelessness, we fixate on the housing form, right? Not ignoring those systems that contribute to it and the people that are in it. And I think the first step in ending homelessness is acknowledging that people who are homeless are rights holders, as Leilani would say, but are also people of capacity, ability, potential, and value, and that they should be in charge of their own lives. And if you start there, you build much better policy.
Too.
Yeah.
Margaret, do you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, I think, it's interesting when John started talking from a planning perspective, my hackles started to rise a little bit, thinking about the viewpoint of privilege, the reality that there are huge inequities in our entire world, and more so in the Indigenous and non-Indigenous spectrum. But what I think in a short nutshell to your question, do we start from a policy perspective? Do we start from a supply perspective? The reality around housing is that we have to look at it in its entirety. I always like to call it 360-degree viewpoint of housing. And I think that The housing sector in and of itself has never really been viewed as a profession, as an industry,
Right.
as the actual front line for all solutions. And so I think it has to be, in its entirety, it has to be the federal governments, the provincial governments, the municipal governments, and it has to be from a policy perspective as well. We have to take a look at what brought us to the conditions that we're in, recognize the disparities that have only been enhanced because of this COVID-19 structure, and take a multi-pronged approach. So I saw one of our viewers put on the chat a question about the modular units, and Tim kind of spoke to those about the rapid response. Here in British Columbia, we've released, and I don't know the numbers, I'm not the detail person that keeps those kind of statistics in my mind, but we've released thousands of rapid response units that have alleviated the crisis. And then COVID-19 hits, and we see we've only touched a minuscule of the actual homelessness challenges here in BC. So we need more, and we need multi-pronged.
You know, here's a question about whether we have this perverse opportunity during COVID. You know, lots of things that people said would never happen. Oh, no, you'll never have the political will to do that, to get a basic annual income, universal income. Well, now we sort of have one. You know, do we have a window here where the federal government is actually far more involved in every aspect of life at the moment with Canadians than they have been for decades? Right? So is there a moment here, Leilani, what do you think? Do we have a window where they will, I've heard from both Tim and others and you, time for the federal government to take some leadership here. Do you think this is our moment? Will you get them to?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things. First of all, I don't think my approach is a 30,000 feet approach. I actually think it's sort of more what Margaret was saying. What we say about up here has a direct and real impact at the most local level. What resonates for me the most is when I'm hearing community workers who are talking about tent encampments being dismantled in the midst of COVID, and their struggle around that, and them knowing homeless people are safer in some of those encampments than they are in some of the shelters.
Right.
And that's related to the right to housing. So that zoomed out thing we're talking about. I think the jurisdictional issue is a complete red herring. I am actually so very, very tired of the jurisdictional debates and things that are being thrown back at me when I'm saying I want to see federal government leadership here. Look, the federal government has been very clear that we need ventilators, and everyone needs ventilators across the country. Ventilators are a form of health administration. It's part of administering healthcare. That's a provincial jurisdiction. The federal government is running around trying to find ventilators.
Right.
Housing is no different than a ventilator in this pandemic. And it to me, we have, and Margaret knows probably much more about this than me, but in Canada, we have this thing called Jordan's Principle. And it relates to an Indigenous youth who fell through the cracks because all these jurisdictions were pointing fingers, and the youth ended up dying. Jordan ended up dying as a result of all of this inaction and finger pointing. Mm-hmm. That's a principle that we can zoom out and say, that is a principle that should be applying here in the midst of a deadly pandemic. Who gives a flying about jurisdiction right now? Homeless people are being not protected in an equal way that other populations in this country because of their status as homeless people. And the federal government should be right there. And same with renters. I mean, I can't believe the federal government can step up and say, businesses, we're going to support you and make sure you can pay your rent. Renters, oh, that's for the provinces and territories to deal with. I'm sorry, that's unacceptable. This is a deadly pandemic. We're not talking about jurisdictional issues. It's a red herring to me.
So can we, you're getting lots of support on the chat box here. A lot of people saying, yeah, that's right. And I saw you be very prudent and not want to say it, but I think what you're saying is fuck jurisdiction. We need to think about how you get the job done, right? And do we sit around and wait?
Yeah, and the federal government should use its, I'm not saying the feds should be meddling. Cities are good at doing certain things. I mean, people on this call know that much better than I do. Cities are good at doing certain things. Social workers are good at doing certain things. You know, provinces are good at doing certain things, but federal government is good at leadership. And we have in place a prime minister who's actually a good leader and has, from the get-go with this pandemic, been a leader. But he's selling out people living in homelessness and renters in precarity for what? I don't know. And CMHC is an amazing, the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corp, for those who don't know. They have amazing leverage. Cities, I've talked to a few mayors and city officials who say, you want me to buy a hotel and then eventually convert that hotel into long-term, deeply affordable housing? Maybe, but wow, that's outside my bailiwick. That is not outside the bailiwick of CMHC. They could be helping cities buy, and then cities could use.
Well, and there are, and I think there are some mayors and some councils that are actually looking at this. And the question is, can you do a certain? Can you, as I suggested, are certain things possible now that wouldn't be in a time of peace, but now in a time of crisis they become possible. So acquiring more facilities that have the capacity to be adapted for this use. Could they be transitional housing, John, as you're suggesting? Lots of questions here about modular and whether or not there was already pre-COVID an awareness that Vancouver was much further ahead in terms of getting modular housing up. And this kind of lament we always get that it would take too long. John, do you have thoughts on other kinds of things that we should stick with, not just through this pandemic, but after?
Yeah, first of all, I do agree with the three tiers being looked at simultaneously. There's no way you can do one without the other. But I will point out that,
John, I'm going to have to stop you again because we're getting that feedback again. Darn. I think that maybe the suggestion may be that you unhook and hook back up, and as soon as you do, I'll come right back to you. Okay? It's frustrating. I know.
Now.
Okay. Tim, you're nodding. Can you pick up while we wait for John to come back?
Well, you know, I love going on webinars with Leilani because I can just say, yeah, what she said. It makes it a lot quicker. She's way more eloquent. But you know what? I think the most important decision in ending homelessness is deciding you're going to do it. Right. And it's not like we can't. Don't tell me we can't. I live in Calgary. 2013, we had a flood. 75,000 households were displaced. 75,000 households. None of them are still homeless. Only except those that were homeless before.
That's interesting.
Right? Grand Prairie had a fire. Yeah.
I want you to continue on that point, and I just want to ask our techs whether it's smarter to have John phone in. Abby Slater suggesting that in the chat, and I'm sure the tech folk are thinking about it. John, let's try it one more time. John, can we hear you now?
Yeah, I hope so.
No.
I'm just saying, so I'm saying that if you go back into history, actually one of the basic forms of providing access to housing was just to survey land up into plots. I think we could be taking lands like the Portlands, other lands around the edge of the city, surveying them into lots, allowing people to begin to inhabit them, but in a way that there's a future there's servicing is needed. The architecture, the housing form is irrelevant. I don't want to say there's any magic answer to that. The forms of housing that existed before 1950 were as diverse as hell. And by the way, they all combined renting and owning. You didn't do one or the other, you did both, because you couldn't own without renting. So I think there are ways of dealing with rapid numbers of people in ways that are much less expensive. Remember, I mean, the province, the federal government settled the prairies in 20 years with a railway and subdividing land up. Essentially, that was what they did. We could be doing that at the scale we need to in and around cities, but of course, we're a victim of colonization too. So the British never wanted cities to have power, and they really don't have any power. We rely on the provincial governments to sort of empower the city to do largely this, and they can't.
Well, and presumably there's a market in there too. The developers that you are your brethren are also calling all the shots because the land's so expensive. I want to just pick back up where Tim was and see if we can combine Tim and John, and we're going to keep our fingers crossed that John's audio works. Tim, you were just suggesting that after the flood, you were able to rehouse people quite quickly, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it was making a decision, right? It's deciding to do that. If you think of if you think about the city organization to end homelessness, it's actually really analogous to what emergency management bodies do during a disaster, right? You have a command center, you have data-driven decision making, you bring all the right people around the table, you deal with the immediate crisis and you keep people safe, but you have an immediate focus on rehousing. The floodwaters hadn't even receded in Calgary. We're clearing out people's basements. We're trying to get them back into their homes as rapidly as possible. We don't do that with homelessness. It is a natural disaster on the same scale as every other disaster, the same impact on health, the same impact on life, the same financial impact.
Let's talk about why. Margaret, why? Why could we come out of this with a total doubling down on sustainable housing, supportive housing, transitional housing, modular housing, all the creating little lots, as John's suggesting? How do we open this up and say, okay, enough, we're going to solve it now?
You know what, I think about your question you asked Leilani, and I want to go back a little bit to the Jordan's principle concept that she talked about. It's certainly something that I've been arguing for many, many years now, that we as governing bodies need to get over our desire for authority and jurisdictional control. But the reality is we're fighting an ancient colonial systemic structure that unless there's a major shift on all levels, I think we're going to end up cycling back. And I see one of our chat viewers talked about their fear around the marshalling of all these supplies, the empty hotels, the modular response units, the empty spaces that have been converted to temporary shelters for people because of the COVID-19. Tim hit it right on the head there. I mean, we're already seeing the capacity for our communities to house people in a moment of crisis. And now all of a sudden COVID-19 hits, the inequities are highlighted. Government suddenly has this capacity on all levels, municipal, provincial, federal, to be able to marshal these units. The fear is when this is over,
right,
are we going to fall back into that system that really is about capitalism at its worst? It's about financializing what we all need as a basic Maslow's first step. We need shelter. And when we start to look at making the almighty buck for the privileged versus the equity that we need, and I talk about equity, if we fall back to that system, we're going to just say goodbye to all those shelters and all those solutions.
So folks, you've been in this field for 20 years. I'm just trying to guess your ages, but some a little bit longer, but more or less 20 years plus. And you've been advocating for this for a long time. It's not, and my sense is that we kind of know, you experts in this field kind of know what needs to happen. So what do you think needs to happen now to get the tipping point so that we will see that as we emerge? Leilani, thoughts?
Well, I actually wanted to dovetail with what Margaret was just saying. I mean, I do think you asked Mary why, like why are things not happening? What's the stumbling block here? And one of them is that unlike so many other social and economic areas, housing hasn't really been viewed in the last 30 years for its social value. So unlike health and education, which remain somewhat intact in this country as social goods, housing has become a commercial good, basically a way to make money, as Margaret just said, and it's been financialized. And so that's part of the problem. There's still this need to readjust. And in the case of a pandemic like this one is the perfect time to make that readjustment.
How do we do it? How do we break it?
I think we have to keep wearing down government and and put back on them the policy that they put to us. Stay home, wash your hands, physical distance. And how do you do that without housing? And when people don't have it, it has to be understood as a social good and a health good right now. The other thing I just want to say quickly is we have in place no accountability mechanisms. And this goes to Margaret's point about as we move forward, so let's say we do a few good things in this city and that city, and this, these people are housed when they weren't before, and these people were protected against eviction when they weren't before. And then bam, the pandemic ends. Are we going to let homeless people just be returned to the street? First of all, under international human rights law, that's retrogressive and a violation. So, but it's like, okay, we have to hold the government accountable. How do we do that? Where are the accountability mechanisms? And the government has stalled because they were supposed to appoint a federal housing advocate, and they were supposed to appoint housing council, and they haven't done it. And they're saying, well, we're going to do that later. Everything's stalled. All appointments are stalled. When this is exactly now is when we need the accountability mechanisms. So I'm going to be pushing on that front, and I bet Tim is too.
I think the important point here, again, can I just encourage people in the chat, including my colleague, Andrew Bond, who's going only to the panelists. Andrew, move your comments to the full group, all panelists and attendees, because you're going to get answers from your fellow chatters as well, not just from the panelists. I think the dilemma then is, as you suggest, and I hear from Van Nostrand, John, I'm an urban autonomy advocate. I want to see if we push more and more responsibility down to cities, and then I want to hold them accountable as a taxpayer. Because as you're quite right, Leilani, it's very hard now to, who do you hold accountable? And I find us in an awkward place here where we have a big expectation of the federal government that's got the checkbook. They can, for this window anyway, have a lot of influence over what the priorities are that are chosen. And where does that live? I know Margaret says, you don't want us to just use the jurisdiction thing as an excuse anymore. But the dilemma is, how do we actually create solutions?
And Mary, who is consulting with the government in terms of its economic stimulus package here in Canada? BlackRock, the largest, one of the largest private equity firms in the world. So where is the oversight for all of this, at least from a homelessness and right to housing point of view?
John?
Mary, I just think, again, to say that Canada has always been a receiver dealing with homelessness from the very beginning. I mean, 1950, we had a huge immigration flow in here in 1900, 1920, all from the UK, but actually people who were homeless in the UK who came here, we attacked, they took on themselves the responsibility of dividing up land, getting some services, building housing that at least could be improved over time. It's still, many of it's still there. CMHC had one really interesting idea after the Second World War, where they rehoused 80,000 veterans by putting 10 of them in a shed, treating them how to build a wartime house. They all built the 10 and they drew straws. I mean, what could be better? And there was something called a mortgage introduced that hadn't existed before.
So do we?
So
yeah.
We've done it.
Yeah, can we learn from our history?
We should go out and do it. We should go out and do it.
Okay, so
go out and do it.
In the spirit of getting out and doing it, I mean, we have a session on Thursday, our City Talk, which is about immigration. And, as you are all recognizing, immigration has built Canada, and what's going to happen to immigration in this new global pandemic, anxiety-ridden place. So we'll talk with those folks about what do they see as the need for this. But what about the idea of just going out and doing it? Margaret, that's what you've been doing. You went out and did it. Can we, and Leilani, I'm interested in Tim, can we use COVID as a chance to empower people to go out and start doing some stuff? Yes?
Yes.
Tim?
Yep. Well, and I think, I think there's three things here, right? Well, first is, I think, a part of the right to housing is making sure that right holders have power. Right? So we need to find a way to ensure that homeless people, marginalized people, people living in core housing need have power, have political power. And that comes up to all of us. There are 1 million Canadians who have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. And there's all the people working the system, and there's all the people on this webinar. Together, we can create a political movement that forces that change. I mean, the second thing is, thinking about Jordan's principle, one of my heroines, is Cindy Blackstock, right? And she is brave and she's fearless and she takes on these challenges. And I think we have to do some of the same thing and be assertive as civil society and other leaders. And the third thing, it really comes down to, you know, the folks on this call, the municipal leadership, whether you're in a formal leadership position or not. I mean, the big thing is deciding to end homelessness. Even without the federal government support, you can bring political leaders to support you. In Alberta, I'll close with this. In Alberta in 2009, the cities got together and convinced the province to end homelessness. And you may not know this, but Alberta is the only province in Canada with province-wide reductions in homelessness.
Because?
And that's because the cities got together and got the resources of the province delivered to the cities. An $800 million investment by the Ed Stelmach government in 2009, right, in housing.
And they didn't wait for anybody's permission, I guess.
They didn't wait for anybody's, but the success there has been limited because they haven't had the resources of the federal government. But again, you know, Edmonton has reduced chronic or overall homelessness 43%. Every major city in Alberta has reduced homelessness.
I was going to ask you guys that. I mean, do we have examples of communities that are doing it really well? Are there some
Yes.
Are there some pockets of innovation and real effective action that we now need to just say, okay, let's let those go viral and pump those out? You're suggesting Alberta's had
absolutely. Well, and now in Ontario, we have Guelph, Kawartha, Chatham, Kent, Dufferin County. I mean, some places where you're having some real rapid success, but we haven't taken it on the really large scale yet.
And
Margaret, you were going to throw something in?
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question, and I can't help but take a look at it from a vulnerable perspective. And yes, I speak largely from the Indigenous perspective. I see one of our viewers inquired about the inequities, you know, from a gender, race, a broader gender, race kind of perspective. And I look back on my education in criminology, and I think about a book that my mentor, Speaker of the House actually for BC, Daryl Plekas, gave me a book in my early education called Fragile Freedoms. And it's about our fragile freedoms here in Canada. And the reality of what we're seeing today, as Tim alluded to earlier about the emergency response capacity of our country, when the emergency abates, we all fall back to our comfort zone, which was living under this jurisdictional challenges. And I want to pick up where you had talked about accountability and not falling back into, you know, jurisdictional. Accountability versus responsibility are two different things. When accountability has to be broken down by jurisdiction for sure, but responsibility is this entire country responsibility to not allow our country to fall back to the comfort zone of just letting our government dictate to us how we're going to move things forward. We as people, Tim here, John, Leilani, yeah, we've been in this battle for a long time. And there are really good people in multiple levels of government at all levels. But what happens is these good people get stuck in the old systemic process of government telling us how we're going to move things forward. We need to change that conversation.
Yeah, I'm hearing a call for revolution. Just saying. Leilani, do you want to chime in on this?
Yeah, I mean, I like what both Tim and Margaret just said. I think that what needs to happen now is for people living in homelessness to claim some political power here. And I think what they need to do, and I'm actually committing myself to making this happen on a global scale, not just a Canadian-wide scale, is to claim their right to a decent place to live during this pandemic and post-pandemic period, and that is the only thing they will accept from their governments, all levels of government. And I also think that if you look at any really, truly long-term successful approach to addressing homelessness, what you'll see is basically a housing first approach, which is ensure people have access to decent housing with social supports, but you will also see alongside that structural change. And that's where you address what are the causes of homelessness, because housing first doesn't address causes always. And so the problem we're in right now is, you know, I've heard government officials here say very clearly, this program to aid this group of people is because we are in a state of emergency. This is not structural change. You know, when Bill Morneau, finance minister, was asked by Senator Kim Pate whether they're considering, you know, a guaranteed annual income, he said, the monies we're providing are emergency monies. We are not looking at structural change. Now is not the time. So that's a big fight that we have before us, because there's a lot of structural change that's quite necessary to address the issues raised on this chat.
John, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I'm just going to go back to the practical level, but I think one of the interesting examples that happened in Toronto was Tent City back, whatever it was, 15 years ago. And I think that kind of energy and the exposure that happened around that with a little bit of planning and involvement to keep it a bit organized and assume from the beginning it's going to remain in place can happen, and can happen at a big scale. You know, after all, I hate to talk about history all the time, but when you came to Ontario originally as a homeless person, you got a lot. You got the right to occupy it for 2 years. And in that period, you had to build a house 16 by 20. That was all, just dimensions. There wasn't any other rules. And when you had that house built, you got a deed. So you then owned the property. We've used that all in lots of other places. But that kind of simple approach, I believe, is really, really required right now. And I can tell you, our condominiums, when I say building condominiums, everybody gets nervous, but all it is, it's a floor plate divided into lots. And you can buy 1, 2, 3, or 4 and make the unit of your choice. And you can buy them as basic, they're legally occupiable, or you can buy them as turnkey. So, you know.
Okay, we're kind of heading into the home stretch here, guys, and I'm just curious about a couple of bigger questions. What do you think it's going to take to do this? I've heard Leilani say we're going to have to hold governments accountable to not just see these as temporary measures. We're going to have to try to make it stick. What about money? What about access to money to actually fund the kinds of granular housing supply that I'm hearing John describe? Do people have a sense of that? Would access to more money, I'm talking about to create the supply, not just to raise the incomes of people. Would access to more money create more of the supply, Tim, that you think we need to absorb people that are not housed?
Yeah, I think the issue of money is important. I think the issue is also making best use of the money we have. You know, in 2007, we did a study in Calgary of the amount of money being invested in homelessness, and it was $350 million a year that was being spent on things that didn't actually end anybody's homelessness. So I think part of it is using the money we have better, but and making sure the new investments are effective, but use the right to housing as a way of designing policy, because that's substantially how you make good policy is around, we talk about housing and the units and the structures and the systems, but we don't actually talk about the people in those structures, in those systems. And the first step is talking to them. This is how the private sector works, you know, give them, you know, find out what the customer wants. The customer has power, you get a better system. Apply that to social policy, use the right to housing as your founding principle.
Yeah, so it's a question here, can you ladder up specific kinds of examples? As Leilani is saying, you mobilize the user group, the people that are experiencing this viscerally, and then you ladder up policies that will work, that can affect interventions that will work locally, and then policies that need to be put in place to support them at the provincial and federal level. Last question for everybody. John, we've lost your mic, so I'm afraid you're going to have to either move to American Sign Language, or we'll just know. You could type something in the chat if you like. I'm going to ask for last comments now about allies. Who do you see as the key allies that you need to mobilize as we actually try to come out of this with a changed housing and homelessness system? Leilani, you first.
Yeah, I see city governments as huge and important allies, absolutely. But then also community groups that are working, you know, in the trenches, so to speak, with their boots on the ground. I can't see anyone closer to the realities than those two groups, the people living it, the people working with the people living it, and city level government, key allies. I just want to say one thing about supply, though. I have to. I think people will know, if you've followed me at all, that I'm not a big supply is the answer person. I think that we have a lot of existing supply that and our dollars could go much further if we used existing supply. And the problem with building new supply is we still have to make the structural change to protect that supply from the big financial actors who come in, swoop in, and take anything that's affordable. So regardless, we need regulation of the financial actors. I'm going to end there.
Got it. Tim, 30 seconds to you.
Well, I think we're going to be launching a campaign in the next couple of weeks that's really focused on taking this opportunity to drive for an end to homelessness. So I encourage you all to tune in. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, I would go back to, you know, the point about the right to housing. I think we have to empower people who are experiencing homelessness and housing need, and we have to follow their lead. And the last thing is really just remembering that this is about systems and structures. And so, for example, if you're on a waiting list for social housing, you're usually waiting in housing. So part of the equation is income. We can't forget that, right? And so it's also supply and income and these big systems. But the big thing is deciding that you're going to do it.
Yeah. John, 30 seconds to you.
I think we just have to realize that when you see somebody on the street lying on a grate or with a tent down in the valley, in this case, that's the beginning of a housing process, should be the beginning of a housing process. And our job is to figure out what that process is step by step and facilitate it as best we can. Yes, we need more money, but you can also get started really quickly. And that's an evidence in many other cities in the world where people have taken it in their own hands and they're squatted, or as I like the term in Peru, where they say that they call those young towns. And that's exactly what we need. We need some young towns. We need to survey them out at least with a bit of planning and let them go. And the Portlands have been empty. We've put it aside for years for industry. It's never come. It's just sitting there. You know, it's ridiculous.
It's a young town. Could be a young town.
It's a young town.
Could be a young town. Margaret, last word to you.
Thanks. You know, my bugle call has now become Tracy Chapman's song, talking about a revolution. And I don't say that to incite anything, but I think our ally is really going to be all of our community population. I was going to say you, the people, but then I realized how quickly that could get misconstrued. You know, it's really about our country as a whole starting to take a look at what really was possible during this pandemic and saying it's not acceptable to go back to the status quo, and that we actually push government on all levels and push our nonprofits on all levels. Well, not push, but empower our nonprofits on all levels to maintain the solutions we've already put to ground today and expand on them.
Thank you. You know, I'm just noticing on the chat function, we have a lot of allies on this chat function. We have people working in health systems as part of hospitals. We've got people working in the not-for-profit sector. We've got people working for various levels of government who've been listening to this session. And it really is, how can we, as Leilani suggested, it's not only about new supply. We may have existing relationships and existing systems that could be repurposed to actually move us forward in significant ways. So it's really incumbent on all of us to keep our eyes open and figure out how do we actually get this solved so that we do not have extraordinary vulnerability with this one very diverse sector of homelessness and people that are precariously housed. Can I just take this chance to thank Leilani and Tim and Margaret and John for joining us. Sorry about the technical challenges. John, you were a good sport. I think it would be the cow behind you that put the hex on your audio system. Just saying. And to all our panelists, we're back on Thursday for a session on immigration, which is what built Canada, what is the future of Canada in terms of settlement, and coping with supporting newcomers, and then coping with what may be a big international tide that discourages immigration. So please join us Thursday, midday Eastern. Have a good day, everyone, and thanks for joining us on City Talk.
Thanks, Gary.